Guys, great news out there. All the headlines are saying that the debt crisis has been averted. There's a deal. Everybody's confident. Biden, McCarthy, blah, blah, blah. Everything's great. Everything's going to get figured out. So, all the politicians are playing their part of good guy, bad guy, just like in a real life episode of professional wrestling. Now, I'm going to go over the details of this debt deal. But to summarize it, you could really just say one thing. Both sides are patting themselves on the back for agreeing to spend 40% more than we make each year for the next 2 years. What a great deal. Thanks, guys. So I'm going to look at the details of this deal, and then I want to show an analogy of what's really going on in terms of the GDP, the tax collections, the debt, the deficit, and the interest that we pay on the debt. And I'm going to show this using an example of a person who owns a store that we call the US and see what the numbers really are. Because all these headlines baffle you with BS and try to confuse you and try to pull the wool over your eyes of what the real situation is in this country with our debt. So let's get into it. So Bloomberg is saying crisis averted. Biden and McCarthy signal confidence debt limit deal will pass, but not everybody's so upbeat about this deal. Republicans outright reject the debt ceiling deal, which raises by roughly $4 trillion for 2 years. In other words, we're going to spend $4 trillion more than we currently collect in taxes over the next 2 years. So here's what's in it. Raising the debt ceiling by $4 trillion for 2 years. And this is consistent with the structure of budget deals struck in 2015, 18, and 19. And they're going to roll back non-defense discretionary spending back to 2022 levels. Wow. While capping top-line federal spending to 1% annual growth for 6 years. After 2025, there are no budget caps, only non-enforceable appropriations targets. So is that a nice way of saying they're getting rid of the budget caps? Defense spending is in line with what Biden requested for 2024, roughly $900 billion. The deal fully funds medical care for veterans. It increases the age for which food stamp recipients must seek work to be eligible from 49 to 54, and also includes reforms to expand who is eligible. It claws back tens of billions in unspent COVID-19 funds. No word on the billions of dollars in fraud on those COVID-19 funds. Are they clawing any of that back? So it cuts IRS funding without nixing the full $80 billion approved last year. According to the GOP, the deal will nix the total full year 2023 staff funding request for new IRS agents. Again, it sounds good on paper, but basically they're approving a lot more funding for IRS agents to chase down people who make $600 selling stuff on eBay in a year. So McCarthy is saying this is a win for taxpayers. We're not going to borrow money from China to pay work-capable adults without any dependents to sit at home on their couch. And so some Republicans came out and criticized it and said, hard pass, hold the line, no swamp deals, hold the line, blah, blah, blah. A lot of them say this stuff, but in the end, we end up spending more and more money that we don't have. And this Representative Keith Self tweeted a letter from 34 fellow House GOP members who are committing to hold the line for America against the deal. So this Representative Keith Self tweeted a letter from 34 fellow House GOP members who are saying they're going to hold the line for America against the deal. That sounds great, but in all reality, it will most likely be they're just holding out for some extra pork for their members or their constituents or something like that. I'd like to see them stand up and say, we are not voting for anything that spends more than we take in taxes, meaning a balanced budget. Let's see that happen. So with both sides playing their part, making it look like they're driving a hard bargain and it was a hard-fought battle and all this stuff, and now they finally came up with a reasonable, good deal for the American people. Let's look at a simplified version of what all of these numbers really mean. So let's imagine that the American government was one person, and that one person had a little corner grocery store, right? The GDP of the US is what that grocery store makes in a year in sales. The tax collections of the US government is what that person nets on those sales as their income for the year. Now let's see what that person's personal finances would look like in that situation. So using 2022 numbers, the GDP or the sales of that store for the year of 2022 was $25.46 trillion. Now, this is a historical chart of total US federal tax receipt as a percentage of GDP. In other words, if that store sells whatever it sells per year, your income from it is about between 15 to 20% of that. So let's just say it's 20% of the sales is what you actually take home on that store. And you see that here because it says the total revenues for 2022 are $4.9 trillion. That's from individual income taxes, payroll taxes, corporate taxes, and others. So everybody gets confused when I say trillions of dollars this and billions that. Let's make it very simple. Instead of trillions, we will use thousands, right? So the $25 billion in GDP, let's call that a more realistic number, $250,000 in sales in your little store, right? That's how much you have in sales, but that's not how much you take home. You take home 20% of that, right? So 20% of 250,000 is 50,000. So you are a store owner that takes home $50,000 in income from your store that has $250,000 in yearly sales. But the problem is the outlays, right? So 2022, we spent 6.3 trillion. So that's like saying you took in $50,000 in income, but you spent $63,000 on your credit cards, right? So you're spending $13,000 more than you currently make. So you're making $50,000, but your mandatory spending is $41,000, right? That is, let's say, your rent, your electricity, your car insurance, all of that stuff, right? In this case, it's Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, income security programs. That's 4.1 trillion out of the 5 trillion that the US makes. The discretionary is 1.7 trillion, or if you were making 50,000, it'd be like $17,000, right? And that would include things like going out to restaurants and vacations. That's non-defense, right? That's discretionary. You can cut that out if you actually had to. Even the defense is subjective on how much you can cut and call it discretionary. You can cut a lot of this 750 billion if you needed to. We have something like 800 military bases all over the world. And if you cut a bunch of that out, we could easily cut a lot of this. And so here, the last part, net interest, is like the credit card interest you're paying on your debt, right? And this is 475 billion. So if you were making $50,000, it would be like $4,750 in interest payments alone per year. So here it is in a nutshell. You make, say, $50,000, you spend $63,000 a year. But there's more. So that amount of money that you spend more than you make every year gets added to the total credit card debt that you owe. And that money has been increasing and increasing to the point where it is now at $31.4 trillion. This only goes up to September 2022 when it was 30.93. So that's like saying you make $50,000 a year, but you have credit card debt of $314,000. So now imagine that credit card debt that you had was actually at the interest rates that credit cards these days charge, which is about 20%. That would mean you'd be paying around $63,000 just in interest on the debt that you owe, even though you only make $50,000 a year. So it would be game over way before you even got to that point. But luckily, the government gets to float their debt at much lower interest rates. And so up until recently, it was about 1.6% average interest rate on all the debt, and it's gone up a little bit to 2.07. And so that makes sense. If you have 31 trillion at 1.6%, that's about 480 billion in interest. And so that lines up with the 475 that it showed on the chart. But you see, for every 1 percentage point more in interest that this goes up, you have to spend about 6% more of your yearly salary just to pay the interest. So if interest rates stay elevated and the government has to refloat some of the debt that comes due at the current interest rates, if they have to sell debt anywhere at the current T-bill rates of 5%, let's say, imagine it got to that, or the 10 or 30-year rate got to 5% or something along those lines, that would mean that they would be spending about $1.5 trillion just in interest, which is about 30% of what they take in taxes. So this whole theater of this big debt fight and cutting spending and being responsible and all this stuff, look at what they're doing. 2022, we spent $1.4 trillion more than we made. And now this great agreement is so that we can spend $2 trillion more per year than we make, right? And so 2 trillion on 5 trillion increase is a 40% increase in spending money that we don't have. So that's like saying if you made $50,000, you say, I'm going to budget next year by only spending $70,000 for the next 2 years, even though I only make $50,000 a year. So only in clown world can you agree to overspend 40% more than you overspent the previous year and call that some kind of debt reduction or fiscally responsible or cutting spending kind of deal. And here's one other thing to think about. Everybody talks about the debt as a percentage of GDP, but that is a false comparison. So if our debt is $31.4 trillion and our GDP is about 25 trillion, they go, oh, look, it's not so bad. Our debt to GDP is only like 120%. We can grow out of it and blah, blah, blah. But the US does not take that $25 trillion in GDP. It only takes like 20% of it. So it only gets 5 trillion a year, not the 25. That's like saying you have a store, you have $250,000 in sales in a year, and you net $50,000 in income. There's not a lot of ways you can increase the take of your sales unless you raise prices and people keep coming back and keep buying from you. That's like saying if the US raises taxes, they're going to make more money that they take in, but that doesn't always work that way. So if you look at it realistically, the $31.4 trillion is what you owe, and the 5 trillion is your income. So the debt of the US government is about 6 times more than their yearly income. There's no amount of raising taxes enough to grow your way out of that. So I hope this video gave you a better understanding of where we really stand with our GDP, our debt, the taxes, the interest rates we're paying, and how the increase in interest rates is really going to affect the interest on our yearly debt that we pay. So don't pay attention to the rosy headlines of a great deal. The reality is they're all agreeing to spend more money than we make every year, just like they always do. Both parties, no matter what they say, the end result is spending more than we make and just putting the bill on the taxpayers' shoulders, same as it always was.